with these profiles. So I hope my remarks will give you some ideas. As a member of Congress, being a member of Congress is like going to the university all the time. You hold hearings and you just have a fantastic opportunity to learn a lot. But you also learn something about the process of learning, and that is that people come to the Hill in hearings and they tell you what they think you want to hear, or they ignore things that they really don't want you to know. And so part of the process of learning in the Congress is knowing how to ask the right questions. Right questions to ask, you're not really going to get much of an answer, or you're going to get a spun answer, and you won't really get to the bare bones of what you're looking for. So hopefully during our session today, I'll give you some ideas on questions, how to ask good questions, how to do good research, and how to come up with a profile that is a little richer than what the press secretary of the various members of Congress would put out as the profile they wish you would adopt. And I also would point out a resource, if you haven't already. The Almanac of American Politics is a great resource. It's, I'm sure, online for students. Be careful not to plagiarize. You could take every one of those profiles in there of members of Congress. I would take as sort of a lodestar, something that you would like to do, but you've got to make it your own. You can't take it out of theirs. Well, where to begin? I guess beginning at the beginning is a good place. I was born and raised in southern Wisconsin. You've probably all heard of the town Janesville. It is where Paul Ryan is from. Paul Ryan, the vice presidential nominee. And the Republicans in the last election. Paul Ryan graduated from my high school. I was the first member of Congress to graduate from my high school. The second one was Russ Feingold, a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. And bringing up the rear, as I like to say, is Paul Ryan, who came from our high school as well. I went to the University of Wisconsin. I was a political science major. I'm also a double major with economics as well. I went to the University of Wisconsin Law School. And it was probably during two things in the earliest phases. When we'd gather around our family dinner table, my father and mother, who were, I'd say, moderate Republicans, nonetheless were interested in public affairs. We did not talk about the Green Bay Packers at dinner. We did not talk about, I'll date myself, the Milwaukee Braves. We really talked about politics and what the community ought to be doing, what the nation ought to be doing, what the state ought to be doing. And if I said one thing, my father would argue with me. And if I said the exact opposite, my father would argue with that. It didn't matter. Around our dinner table, we had respectful, but nonetheless, arguments over where the country ought to, I want to legalize pot. He doesn't want to do that. If he wants to legalize pot, I didn't tell him what's wrong with that. There was that kind of stuff going on around our dinner table. Then in high school was the next sort of jumping off point. I was on the debate team, and I was asked to defend right-to-work laws. Well, my father was a businessman, and he just didn't like labor unions, and he thought right-to-work laws were terrible. And so when the debate coach came to me and said, "Bob, you're gonna argue the pro right-to-work position," I don't think I'd been that depressed in my life at that point. I mean, what am I going to do with right-to-work laws? I don't believe in them. But it was a turning point for me because I was able, well, I learned that I'd be able to take a look at the other side of an issue and really come to understand it from the point of view of those who argue for that position. That was a sort of a turning point in my life in high school. I was able to begin to critically think about things. And I suppose it was the inner lawyer in me that was starting to blossom. How do you take a position representing somebody whose position you don't approve of or even agree with, and how can you go and effectively argue that position as an advocate? Well, then in college, there was the anti-war and civil rights movements. Vietnam was going. A lot of my friends went to Vietnam. Some of them didn't come back. That was a pretty traumatic part of our existence then, you know, when we were protesting the war in Vietnam and protesting for civil rights. So that was part of the crucible of my learning in college. And then I ended up, after law school, going to Michigan State University, and I was a graduate student, political science, had a Ford Foundation Fellowship. And after 8 years of higher education, I just got tired of the student standard of living. Hopefully you're not quite there yet, but at some point you want to buy a car, you want to have some nice clothes, you want to, you know, get a new computer or something. You know, you just get tired of it. So I hired on with the Attorney General of the state of Michigan. I became an assistant Attorney General. And one of the very few regrets that I have in life is that I did not complete my master's degree. And it's sort of a checkbox that I left unchecked. So one day I'm in East Lansing, Michigan. That's where Michigan State University is. There's 45,000 students on campus. It's a huge student body. And I am all of, what, 26 or 7 years old. And I decide at that point that I'm going to stay in Michigan, so I have to register to vote there. I kept my voting registration in Wisconsin thinking I was going to return. And I walked into the city clerk's office to register to vote. Simple. Well, I didn't go in a suit and tie. I went in with my blue jeans or whatever else I was wearing that day, a sweatshirt, and I asked to register to vote. So the city clerk said, she kind of sized me up, and she started asking me a bunch of questions, which as a lawyer and as an assistant attorney general, I knew had nothing to do with registering to vote. But she asked them, and I wasn't there to make a big protest. I was there to get the job done and get on my way because I had to do some grocery shopping or some other things. So I just politely answered her questions. And then she popped the following question on me. Do you live in a housing unit where there is a communal bathroom? And my brain seized up. I went, whoa, what does that have to do with my right to vote? I'd given her my address, I'd given her my age, all these other things. And at that point, the brakes went on. I said, I'm not going to answer any more questions. This is silly. Just, I'm here to register to vote. Sign me out. She wouldn't do it. She just flat out said no. So I walked out of the city clerk's office in East Lansing, Michigan, and I walked down the street to a reporter at the local weekly newspaper, the Town Courier, to the reporter who I kind of had hots for. And I said, Linda, come on, let's go back to the city clerk's office. Actually, we did it the next day. This time we did it with a photographer in tow, and Linda stood behind me in line and went through the whole thing again, right down to the communal bathroom question. So that time, I was refused registration to vote, and we walked outside, and they took a picture, and the next day it's on the front page of the weekly newspaper in East Lansing, and then the following day after that, it was on the front page of the Lansing State Journal, again, that newspaper, and after that, it was just endless newspaper interviews, TV interviews, TV spots, the whole thing about how the city clerk of East Lansing, Michigan had refused to register to vote an assistant attorney general of the state of Michigan. Because when I was in there asking to register to vote, I didn't say, well, you don't know who you're talking to, I'm an assistant. I didn't do any of that stuff. So overnight, in this town that I hadn't lived in for very long, I was a one-day news story, or maybe 2 or 3 days. So this was right after the 18-year-old vote was passed. And some students on the campus at Michigan State University called me up and said, we'd like you to be the chairman of our student registration drive. I asked the Attorney General whether that was all right or not. And he said he didn't care. So I did. I signed up, and there I was in the front, on the front page again. And now I became the spokesperson, the talking head, the face of student registration. I wasn't a student, but I was close enough, and the city clerk had said no. Well, make a long story short, the reason I tell you that is that from my dining room table, through my experiences in college, through something that happened to me when I went to register to vote, all of those things sort of combined to my thinking that I ought to run for Congress. Now that's not a straight line, but when you go and ask the person you're profiling, how did you decide to run for Congress? Don't leave it there. They'll tell you something. They've answered that question a million times. Their staffs have answered that question a million times. Ask some questions behind that. You know, when did you first get an interest in politics? Was your family involved in politics? What kinds of conversations did you have with people who were in school with you about politics? Were you ever part of a protest movement? Did you ever sign a petition? Did you ever go and have some kind of moment, the voter registration moment, that got you really kind of angry and got your juices flowing about, I'd like to change that? Is there anything that you encountered with respect to the person who was already in the seat that you hold, that you found that gave you cause to want to take that person out politically? Don't rest with what they say on the answer on the first question. I mean, ask the introductory question, but then get to the follow-up, because it is more, there's a bigger story behind what motivated them to get into office than what they will initially tell you. And that's really important, because if you're trying to figure out what the profile of a member is, you want to find out if there's anything that connects those dots with what they do in office. How do they decide what committee to go to? How do they decide to spend their time? The most valuable thing a member of Congress has is time. The pressures on a member of Congress are not quite as high on those things you think are pressures. Like, am I for gun control or am I against gun control? I mean, listen, by the time you're asked that question and put to that question in a vote, you've danced around that, you've rationalized it one way or the other for years, I mean, that is not a hard thing to do because you've made your way. You've made your way. The bigger pressure on you is how do you spend your day? How do you spend your time? You know, how much time do you spend looking at legislation? How much time do you spend dealing with constituents? How much time do you spend with your staff? How much time do you spend with people who aren't on your staff? Time is the biggest problem, the biggest pressure that members of Congress face. It really isn't the issues as you might want to be led to believe, that people are, that somehow or other a member of Congress's mind is a rope in a tug of war between opposing causes. No, doesn't happen. Once in a while it does. But very, very rarely. Time is the biggest problem. How to spend your time, and how to spend your time effectively. You can spend your time doing nothing, and nothing gets done. And maybe that's the way you like it. Maybe your member of Congress is in a safe district, doesn't have to worry about re-election, has one of those platinum names like a Kennedy name or something, is there on a cruise. There are members of Congress like that. They're there, they might as well be on a cruise. They're cruising through life, they got a fancy title, they got staff, nothing particularly motivates them. When you ask questions about how they got to Congress, well, it was sort of like, Daddy bought me the seat or something like that. That's maybe too simplistic, but there are certain people who are part of family dynasties, and it just sort of happens. They didn't really have to work that hard, or the stars line up and they're at the right place at the right time, and a bolt of lightning, they're suddenly a member of Congress, and it's a safe seat. They don't have to do very much, very little pressure. They're on a cruise. Others are there on a mission. Others, and you'll discern this from how you ask the questions of how they got there and what influences how they spend their time. You'll find out that some people are on a mission. They really want to accomplish something. It's almost kind of a fool's errand, because in Congress you don't accomplish anything by yourself. There are very, 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 very few things that a member of Congress can do and really, in their heart and in their mind, own it. It's a collective body. It is a community. It is how can you... So some members are very persuasive with their colleagues. And they spend a lot of time, coming back to the word time, they spend a lot of time with their colleagues. They try to get to know their colleagues and what make them tick and what motivates them and what turns them off. And they'll try to get relationships going with their colleagues. Other people don't care. Other people in the Congress don't care. They could care. They probably know as many people on the day they leave Congress as the day they came to Congress. They don't go out. They're not outgoing. They're not. They don't try to find out what their neighbor, even in their hallway, in the Rayburn building or the Longworth building. They're strangers with the person next door. And the other thing that you'll find is that all of these members of Congress, are judged by society and at law as being equal. And I think what I'm challenging you to do is to find out what makes the member you're profiling unique. So that means you have to have a point of reference. And hopefully, John, that comes about when they talk with one another about what they found out. Because you can't, the only way to do it really is to go and profile 5 members of Congress. And the comparative profile will tell you a lot. You'll learn a lot, but you don't have time for that, right? So maybe you can educate one another about what you're finding out.
One of the things we will do, which gives me an idea, Bob, and thanks for pointing that out, is they are going to present to each other,
Right.
So that will be part of what the subsequent people will talk about. And maybe in the future, as we fine-tune this idea, thank you again, we might ask for at least 2 profiles to be done rather than.
No, it's a time
It's a
issue.
matter of
Yeah,
time.
yeah, it is a time issue. So, I hope we got that on the table.
You didn't lose anything.
You think that was a martini? Anyway, so you know, that's a little flavor. Let me go through a bunch of high points in my career, and hopefully you'll have some questions of me. And use me really as a laboratory. Ask me the kind of questions you'd ask the person you're going to profile, or the staff person that you have to ask about this.
And low points too, Bob.
And the low points too. Yeah. High points and low points. Well, of course, the high points. Number one, keep in mind. Let's talk about the Congress as a whole. A lot of people think that the Congress is a place. How many people? Let me ask you as a question. How many people here think that Congress is a place where things are supposed to happen? Yeah? Congress makes something happen. All right, you flunk. You all flunk. You flunk. The design of Congress, I'll get to you in a minute. The design of Congress is to make sure something doesn't happen. Think about it. The Parliament, and this, I'll come back to this in a minute because this gets to comparative politics. The Parliament of the UK or Canada is a legislative body that's designed to make things happen. Our government, our Constitution, is the progeny of the parliamentary experience. And our founding fathers had a different point of view. How do we prevent things from happening? So they designed a government, a constitution with a Congress with 2 branches, checking and balancing one another, and the Congress as a whole checking and balancing the executive. And the 2 of them checks and balances with the judiciary, the Supreme Court. The whole idea is to slow things down and make it impossible for anything quickly to happen. That's the purpose of the Constitution. So I'd like to deprogram the idea that's probably in your head that Congress is supposed to make things happen. No. Congress is supposed to prevent things from happening. Now we get into a rub, and I can get to it later, some questions. There are certain things that have to happen every year, like budgets and appropriations and funding of government, you know, those are where the joints of this check and balance thing is really rubbing raw, and it's rubbing raw right now. Because the advantage goes to those people who want the status quo or who do not want something to happen. That's the advantage in Congress. And we can talk about whether the people in Congress who want to prevent things from happening have too much power, a la the filibuster and things like that, or whether it's just right, or maybe for some people, not enough can happen. Think about the gun control debate right now. Enormous advantage in the status quo. Here you have a president using the bully pulpit, Newtown, a couple of states, Connecticut and Maryland, passing new measures to reduce gun violence. Yeah. And those who want that to happen, I do, you know, easily can demean the NRA, which I used to be a member of and left because the nuts took over. The fact of the matter is, the system is on the side of the NRA. The checks and balances work to the advantage of the NRA. The people who want change are pushing a boulder up a hill. But that's how our Congress was designed. It was designed not to be easy. And it has frustrated many of us in the things we want to have happen. But if you get a more charitable view about what Congress is all about, you may not like it. I'm not asking you to like it. I don't know. But I'm asking you to at least have a little philosophy about it. Be philosophical. It more easily apportions your task as the burden of going forward and the burden of persuasion if you want change and it's not coming. On the other hand, if you don't want change on a particular item, then you can probably feel pretty satisfied in our system of checks and balances. If anything happens, it's going to happen slowly. Nothing overnight. But that's kind of the grounding of things. So this kind of informs you about your individual members. Where is the individual member you're profiling? Where is their power? Where is their biggest advantage? Their biggest advantage is just kind of doing nothing, because the checks and balances will make sure nothing happens. If your member of Congress is one of those people who's on a mission, you'll probably want to ask some questions about what are they doing to push that boulder up the hill? How can they do that? What levers of power do they have to make something happen in an institution that is status quo oriented? The default is status quo. Okay? High points. Some of the things that members of Congress do that are high points and give them relief from the do-nothingness of Congress. And incidentally, the do-nothingness of Congress is not new. I mean, we can go back in history, and I won't bore you with those details. But throughout history, if you were to do a survey of news articles, do-nothing Congress or its equivalent are throughout the news. So how do you as a member of Congress, and you're on a mission, how do you express yourself in that kind of an environment? It's very frustrating, very frustrating. Well, there are some little devices that are used. One is a thing called a caucus. While the formal rules of the Congress dictate what committees can do, what jurisdictions they have, how they operate, caucuses are organizations that are much freer. They're invented by members of Congress coming together with a common interest and expressing themselves through if they're not on a committee that deals with agriculture, they can have an agriculture caucus, and they can join it, and they can have all kinds of activities. The caucuses today are not the caucuses of yesteryear. Before Newt Gingrich came in, we had caucuses that were real caucuses. They had staff. You couldn't join up with they weren't a sign-up sheet. You couldn't sign on to a caucus without contributing money from your personal office account to that staff. That isn't the case today. Today it's all just sign-up sheets. But still, it is an effort to be a little more free-form outside the constraints of how the Congress is organized. So ask your members of Congress in profile, what caucuses are they members of? Some of the caucuses they're members of will be because they're really, really, really interested in that. And there's no constituency in their district for that. That's why you have to know a little bit about their districts. If you're from an ag district and your member says, I'm on the ag caucus, well, duh. That's like, if maybe that member's from an ag district, is not on the ag committee, and has to have something that kind of speaks to what the district's all about. And they may have joined that caucus just because somebody asked them to. They don't have to, like I said, they don't have, it does, you can sign up for every caucus if you want. It doesn't cost anything. So caucus memberships are easy. But, you know, if you look at all the caucuses that your profiled member is on, and some don't have anything to do with their constituency, you're probably beginning to look inside their mind. What are they really kind of interested in? What are the kinds of things? You know, it's like asking somebody, when you read the newspaper, where do your eyeball, or not the newspaper, if you're looking at a screen, if you're looking at the news, whatever you're looking at, what are your eyeballs attracted to? What's the story that you read that has nothing to do with your job, has nothing to do with your family, has nothing to do with nothing, you just are interested in it? Well, asking the questions about the caucuses and why is one area to get a little richer profile. Now, I was the chair of the Arts Caucus. For 4 years, I was the chair of the Arts Caucus. What a wonderful experience that was. I got to meet, you know, I got a picture in that I absolutely love. A picture of me with Dolly Parton, Suzanne Summers, Downey, what's the woman, Sarah Jessica Parker. I mean, I had an opportunity to meet a lot of people. It was a lot of fun. I was not a chair of a committee. I wasn't on anything that had to do with arts and entertainment. I was interested in protecting intellectual property and supporting funding for the endowment for the arts and humanities. I have one picture where I'm standing between Billy Joel and Christie Brinkley. And Christie Brinkley is tall, and Billy Joel is short. And every time I look at that picture, I used to say, she needs a taller man.
Those who took your advice?
Yeah, later on she had a problem, but I mean, you know, when you're a member of Congress, you know, ask the question, what does your member of Congress do for fun? What is it that sort of gets a smile on their face? And the Arts Caucus was one of those things for me. We did a lot of important things. It wasn't all frivolous, but we did very serious things. I remember one of the days I remember even the most. In my Wilder-Mitty world, if I could have been anything but a congressman, I'd have been a songwriter. I do play the piano poorly. And I really admire people who can put lyrics to music. And does this have anything to do with my district? No. Does it have anything to do with Vietnam and Civil? No. This is me. I just like it. And I would love to have been a songwriter. So one day, as chairman of the Arts Caucus, I managed to convince BMI and ASCAP, the two licensing groups for songwriters, to hold a what's really called, I guess, an audition session or a workshop on Capitol Hill. We took over the Cannon caucus room in the Cannon building, and there were the likes of Hal David, Mike Reed. These are names that maybe don't mean anything to you, but they're famous composers. Hal David, What the World Needs Now, Love, all that kind of stuff. And Mike Reed, who was a former Cincinnati Bengal who left to write songs in Nashville. He left an NFL career to write songs in Nashville. I'm trying to think of the one he did. His most famous song was Stranger in My House or something like that. Many of them country. Anyway, these two organizations brought songwriters to Washington, D.C., Cannon Caucus Room, and for hours auditioned new songwriters. And it was fabulous. I got so much satisfaction out of doing that. I mean, because I was having trouble getting job satisfaction, you know, dealing with the ordinary time constraints of day-to-day life in the Congress. So that was one high point, and others. I was at the signing of the SALT agreement. I was appointed by Carter as an advisor to the SALT negotiations in Geneva. And I was at the SALT signing in Vienna with Carter and Brezhnev. He introduced me. You know, President Carter introduced me to President Brezhnev for the first time. You know, it doesn't happen very often. You know, that you get psychic income from these kinds of things. You want to ask the member that you're profiling, where do they get their psychic income? Because after a while, people calling you congressman doesn't give you the psychic income. Believe you me, it doesn't. It just sort of rolls off your back. There's got to be something in the job that keeps you coming back. There's got to be something there that keeps you running again. Because running in campaigns and all that stuff can be really, can be drudgerous. It's boring sometimes. I hate to tell you this, and they won't tell you this, but it is boring to go to town meeting after town meeting after town meeting after town meeting because all the questions repeat themselves. It's very, very, you got to go through a dozen town meetings before you get a new challenging question. And almost none of the questions sort of get your intellectual juices going. It's all public relations. Well, anyway, I'm talking too much about too many details, I think. What else should I talk about here?
You were on a number of fascinating committees, including being an appropriator, being on transportation, and being on services. Tell us about some of your committees.
Well, the committees are where you gain your expertise if you didn't have it to begin with. That's where you sit in hearings after hearings after hearings and learn fabulous, fabulous things. I'll tell you one little story. Armed Services. We're sitting in a closed, classified briefing on cruise missiles. And the person from the Defense Department discloses to us that they had developed stealth technology that they were going to put on a cruise missile. And lights went off in my head, and a couple of my colleagues' heads. Stealth technology? What's that? I mean, it's all in the public domain now. Everybody knows about stealth technology, but then nobody knew about it. In fact, the person who we asked some follow-up questions, the person told us that they had actually put together a plane, not just a cruise missile, but a plane, and they had mounted it on some kind of test rig of some kind, and then they aimed radars at it, and couldn't see it. And that one day, I'll remember this because it was really dramatic, one day, this was outdoors someplace, obviously, a bird came and sat on top of the plane. And the radar could pick up the bird, but couldn't pick up the plane. Well, lights started going off in our heads because in that hearing, it was at a time when Jimmy Carter was newly the President of the United States, or within a few years. And he was trying to make a decision about the B-1 bomber and whether to cancel it or not. And we instantly knew in that hearing that the B-1 bomber was not the latest technology, that building it was building an obsolete weapon system for hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. So my colleague Tom Downey and I, we demanded to have a full briefing on it, and a most unusual thing happened after that full briefing. A whole host of flag officers, generals in the Air Force, came into our offices and required us to sign a document that we would never disclose what they had told us. Now, members of Congress, by virtue of their election, have top security clearance. Members of Congress can see the topmost secrets of our nation's intelligence services without any further prior clearance. So it was extraordinary that they came and asked us to sign a document. Well, we did. But then the thing we did was kind of funny. Zbigniew Brzezinski, if you watch Morning Joe, Nika, his daughter, is one of the co-hosts, and she frequently has her father, Zbigniew Brzezinski, on as an expert. He was the National Security Advisor to President Carter. So Tom Downey and I went to Brzezinski and we said, you know, we knew that they were thinking about canceling the B-1 bomber, whether to cancel. And we said, were you aware of stealth technology and how that would eclipse B-1 bomber, how it was going to be obsolete? And Brzezinski said, no, he didn't know anything about it. So he learned about stealth technology from Tom Downey and Bob Carr, who were just junior members of the Armed Services Committee. And we had happened on something that his own Defense Department hadn't told him. He called up the Secretary of Defense and read the Riot Act at the Secretary of Defense for not telling him about this, because it played heavily into the decision. We had written a paper about this. And when Carter announced that he was canceling the B-1 bomber program, chunks, talk about plagiarism, chunks of our memo showed up in his statement. I mean, it was a day when we felt we really had made a difference. Not as legislators, per se, not passing laws, but we had learned something in our federal government that had an implication for what they were deciding in the White House. The White House didn't have all the facts. And the Pentagon didn't give them all the facts. Why? Because the Pentagon knew that if they told the president about stealth technology, they would be deep-sixing their own favored program, the B-1 program, upon which millions of jobs were supposedly at stake, and huge sums of money, and blah, 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 and defense contractors and the rest. Well, he canceled it, and that became a very big issue in the presidential election between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan accused Carter of being soft on defense, canceling the B-1 bomber because it was to replace these B-52 bombers that were older than the pilots who flew them, and blah, 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 blah. And Carter then tried to defend by saying, well, there's this thing called stealth technology, and we're not going to build a plane that's going to be obsolete. At which point, all of the hawks came in and lambasted Carter for disclosing national secrets to save his political butt. Well, I think he had a right to do that. Well, you know what happened. Carter's defeated, Reagan gets elected, and what do they produce? He turns around the decision and they produce the B-1B. They call it the B-1B. Anybody here know what the B-1B is? You ever seen it? They produce hundreds of these things. Obsolete the day they rolled off the assembly line. Huge waste of money. Lined the pockets of military contractors. And of course, by then, the information about stealth technology is coming out. And, oh, we got to build that one too, called the B-2B. Not the B-2B, B-2. So you see that, I mean, they even flew B-2s over to North Korea the other day, or South Korea. You know, and the B-1B, I don't know what they did with them. Probably chopped them up, used them for scraps. So that's some of the interplay that can happen between a member of Congress and the executive. One of the kind of the high points.
Later on, we're going to talk a little bit about the budgetary process and appropriations, but give us a little taste of what it's like being an appropriator, Bob.
Well, appropriators then were very powerful. There's a dividing line in terms of how you ought to think about the Congress. Pre-1995 and post-1995. Pre-1995, committees were powerful. Committee chairs were powerful. If you got to be a committee chair, you really did have power. As chairman of the Transportation Appropriations Committee, I could decide how much money our country was. and it literally, you know, there's a lot of people working on these projects, so you can't claim sole credit. But every transportation bill started on my desk. Why? Because the Article 1 of the Constitution, which empowers the Congress, says that no money shall be spent unless appropriated. So, I mean, the Appropriations Committee comes as close as you can get to being enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. The power of appropriations, the so-called power of the purse. Well, it also says that money bills have to start in the House, not the Senate. It doesn't. I mean, there are examples of when that's not observed. But, so in the House, with regard to transportation, the money bill for transportation literally started on my desk. So as the twig is planted, so grows the tree. There's a lot that follows from, it's called a markup. You know, I produced the bill that spent all the money for transportation. And everything, all the way through the Senate to the President's desk, was a drop or an add from what I had started. And of course, as the person who manages that process, I'm in a key position to fight off amendments, to accept amendments. You know, I'm in a position of deal maker. Huge power. The chairs of the appropriations subcommittees were dubbed cardinals, taking their analogous to the cardinals of the Catholic Church. The idea being that the cardinal, the Pope is the speaker, and the cardinals are the appropriations subcommittee chair. Post 1995, that's not. They don't quite live up to that term. Most of the power is in the Speaker's office today, and committee chairs, whether on appropriations or any other committee, are really kind of functionaries. They're more like employees of the Speaker. Their job, and that's one sad commentary about what's happened to the Congress. Members of Congress today aren't real legislators in what I think is a robust sense, where you have a lot of people putting their minds to the task and trying to figure out the best course for America. It's really more like, it's not exclusively, it's more like they're functionaries. As a member of Congress, your job is to raise money for the party, plain and simple, and give the Speaker your vote on almost everything. Or the leader of your party. If you're a Democrat in the House today, it's what's happened is, since 1995, is that the parties, which are private groups incidentally, there's nothing in our Constitution or our laws that make parties any kind of a public entity. They are private clubs, bipartisans, and they've taken over the process. But we can talk more about that. But anyway, the committee structure is more a facade today than anything else.
Now we've got plenty of time for questions about virtually anything.
Yeah, I'm here as long as you want.
Okay.
I was going to ask what you just said about congressmen being no longer legislators, but more so party advocates. So, but we've seen a lot. I would agree with you. I'd say more. I mean, for most of this past decade, but I feel like more as recent, the parties have seen a lot of breaking apart and a lot of more individualism. Some of the congressmen, especially with the introduction of the Tea Party and some other elements that are, you know, more fragmentary towards that, especially the GOP. I feel like congressmen aren't necessarily party advocates, because I feel like if that was the case, it may be easier to get things passed in Congress. Whereas there's a lot of, you know, friction between even individuals now. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree with you that the parties are not monolithic. There are many subgroups inside each of the parties. But the question is, where is the party discipline? I could kind of diagram this for you a little bit. And I won't go into the awful long history, but during the speakership of people like Joe Cannon, all the power was in the speaker's office. So you had a very, very strong speaker, and the reform against that was the seniority system. People don't remember that. But the seniority system was a reform against all power being in the speaker. And so the seniority system really broke up the speaker's thing so that not only was, and the speaker's power was made smaller, but then the committee chairs were empowered. And they were selected on the basis of, and it's a matter of selection, personal selection, based on how long they've been on the committee. So the speaker didn't determine who the chairs were. It was based on how long you'd been on the committee, and that was based on how many times you'd been reelected. So this pertained for a long period of time until about the 1970s. When people in the Congress decided that the seniority system itself had certain problems because it put too much power in the chairs of the committees. And this was particularly important during the Civil Rights era, when the people who got reelected time and time and time again were Southern conservative Democrats. And they were the chairs of the committees. And it didn't really matter if the speaker was pro-civil rights. They could bottle up legislation in committees and not pass civil rights reforms. So by the 70s, that was, throughout the 50s and the 60s, this was boiling. But by the 70s, it really reached a zenith. And what happened was, an idea was invented to sort of put a check and balance, if you will, on the speakers, on these chairs, and it was the caucus. Now, I will use the word caucus because that is the term that the Democrats use. The Republicans have a caucus, they call it a conference. Same thing. All the Democrats, all the Republicans meeting together. So the Democrats decided that caucuses, whether Republican or Democrat, should have some control over who is the chair of the committee. Seniority still would be preeminent, but then that only allowed you to be nominated, but your chairmanship was, you were elected by the caucus. Seniority, in other words, the most senior person would be up for an up or down vote on whether they would continue or not, and they could be voted down, and frequently were, and then they'd have to run against somebody else, and it would be a competition. I'm not going to draw them all, but that's what happened. So it was power of the chairs in the committees, but modified. They owed their job not just to seniority, but they owed their job to the caucus. Now this is a good news, bad news kind of thing. It worked for a long time, and it worked largely because the Democrats put this reform into place in the 70s, about the time I was elected. And it worked through the 80s, and it worked through much of the 90s. But it was a scheme that was authored by the Democrats. And so they operated it as they intended to operate it. But then what happened was that in 1995, the Republicans threw the Democrats out, and what they did was throw out this. Whoops. Throw out this, and we're back to everything being in the Speaker's office. Yeah, you have committees. Yeah, you have chairs of committees. The chairs of the committees in the new regime, the Speaker selects the chairs of the committees. And here's what's really insidious. Those chairs are up for auction. Maybe some of you heard about this, but it hasn't been widely reported. So if you want to be a chair of a committee in the Congress of the United States today, it's all about money. The Speaker will come to you and say, you know, I'm about to appoint you to be Speaker, or to be chair of a committee. And I would like from your campaign to my campaign, essentially, about $50,000. Well, maybe you don't play that kind of a game. Or maybe you can't come up with $50,000. Well, you don't want to do it? How about you? You give me $50,000, you're on the same committee, I'll appoint you Speaker. That's exactly the way it happens today. Exactly the way it happens. It's been documented in a number of cases where people have been passed over because they will not give the Speaker money. Now, it's not just, I don't want you to think that that Speaker was putting it in his own wallet. It's money to the campaign committee. It's money to the Speaker's political action committee, the so-called leadership PACs. You know, it's what are you going to do for me to be chair? That's what's deciding this to it.
And it's both parties.
That's the other thing. I want to say clearly, this was instituted by Newt Gingrich, but when Pelosi took over, she didn't change it. In fact, she expanded it. So now what's happened is, actually, you know, as a Democrat, this is a hard thing to say, but in a way, one of John Boehner's problems is that he has tried to reform this a little bit. John Boehner is more of a reformer in this kind of dynamic than Nancy Pelosi was. He's still asking for money. Money still drives the process. But he has reformed it slightly, and is giving chairs a little bit more power. Even those he selects, he's giving them a little more discretion. But not a lot. But that's what we've got now. It's a sorry, broken process. Yeah.
So it's this. So the Speaker of the House has the ability to change how that works, then?
Well, this is the role of the caucus. This gets to the caucus. And this is where, going back to who asked the question about it's not, this is a little oversimplified diagram, but I would say there's also the caucus. That is a little bit different because now the caucus reigns supreme. Incidentally, the caucus has rules. But the only rules that you and I kind of think are important for the Congress of the United States are the Constitution. And the Constitution says that the House and the Senate shall make their own rules. So the House and Senate have rules. But standing in the shadows are the rules of the caucus. Because the caucus of the majority party, and now this is the House, the Senate's a little bit different, you want to talk about that, we can do that. But the caucus rules determine what the House rules are. And the caucus rules determine this kind of stuff. And those aren't, you know, I suppose you can go on the internet and find the House Republican Conference rules or the House Democratic Caucus rules. The only rules that matter are the ones of the majority party anyway. But that's what's going on, and here's where Boehner's got a problem. It's because he's got enormous power. He's the most powerful person in the Congress, and he's the most powerful person in his caucus. But the caucus is a little bigger than he is. So Tea Party activists and whatever else, what other factions, they're really sort of in charge. And of course, Boehner's got his own rivalry with Cantor and Majority Leader and all these other things going on. So the system is really broken. I mean, the two scholars, Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann, have written books about this stuff. And their first book was The Broken Branch. And their second book is It's Worse Than It Looks. And I've talked to Norm about what the title of the third book is going to be.
We've actually talked about both of those here in this class and about it. And maybe that will lead you to the next question about it to others, is that is, see me encapsulate this one. You've seen Congress in your day when they used to pass a lot of legislation, and there seemed to be at least times of bipartisan cooperation. To the Congress of today, things have changed. How and why have things changed, Bob? And should or can anything be done about it?
Well, we've got to do something about it. But the thing is that buttressing the money thing is gerrymandering. We've talked about that before. So what's really happened now is that the districts, you know, parties have always tried to lay in a fix. That is, lay in a permanent victory through reapportionment. Going back to Governor Jerry, basically. The thing that's different today, though, is technology. In the old days, I'll take my own district, for example. My district was designed to be a Republican district, using the technology of the day. However, they did it on the assumption that city clerks in East Lansing would be able to keep students from voting. I got to Congress in part because of an issue I had with voter suppression, and I was being the guy suppressed. And we now hear voter suppression talk in the last campaign. So, but my district was designed to be a Republican district, to give an advantage to the Republicans. But that depended on them keeping student registration at Michigan State very low, and it was based on certain back-of-the-envelope analysis of what voting behavior would be in small townships and small towns and a whole host of other things. That's all changed. With computer technology, your smartphone has the computing capability of designing a district using big data in the cloud that will probe the down to the granular level the voting tendency of everybody in a geographic area. So the designer districts of today aren't like the gerrymandering of yesterday. They are a big super fix. So what have they done? They've managed to create these districts where the extremes of each party have more influence. But I would say, frankly, it's more the Republican Party. The extremes of the Republican Party, the Tea Party, if you will, have the ability to determine the politics of that whole district. Why? because the contest is in the primary, it's not in the general election. Between 35 and 50 seats, about 10% or less of the Congress of the United States have seats which are truly competitive. The rest are all decided on based on reapportionment. You know, why even bother? And within those districts, the organized, in the Republican district, the organized Tea Party types, they hold sway. So even a member of Congress who is a moderate Republican, who wants to make deals, who wants to do the right thing, who looks at his or her own mission as trying to get something done, has to be looking over their shoulder at some Tea Party activist running against them in a primary. That's where the contest is. So if you're a Democrat in that district, you don't even need to bother. You don't have a voice. You don't have there's no way you can impact that process. So it's reapportionment, and then the money thing has gotten really worse. It started with a court decision by the name of Buckley versus Vallejo. Buckley versus Vallejo was a court decision many years ago that decided that not only do natural people have free speech, but they can amplify their free speech to the detriment of everybody else if they have money. So in a sense, the money can amplify a person's speech, even if it's drowning out the speech of the person next door. Well then, the Citizens United case came along and said not only do natural persons have free speech, but artificial persons have free speech, i.e. corporations. And labor unions, but labor unions don't have much. I mean, it's really, that was really a corporate decision. So you take those two things, and then I'll add a third one, and this is for the United States Senate alone, the filibuster, abuse of the filibuster, which I will submit to you as unconstitutional. There's a court case that's winding its way through the courts right now on that issue. But those three things are why we got where we're at today.
Now, I promised these folks I'd try to take a break right about now, but
Okay.
with the next maybe 5 minutes, if anybody's got a question related
Do you want me to come back, or do you have some other plan?
we've got to go and talk about
Okay.
the budget today,
Okay.
Bob. So
All right.
unfortunately, but you are invited to come back anytime.
All right.
And like I say, your words will be recorded and used in the subsequent class.
Okay.
So they will echo. They will echo. Any follow-up questions for Congressman Carr related to what you're doing? Go ahead, Michael.
This is more of a general question, but I'm interested in the interaction between the legislative and the executive branches, and I'm wondering if you see the relationship between those change from when you were in Congress, or if the nature of the relationship is always different depending on who is president.
Well, the only thing that's perhaps changed is that now you have, which I think was an honest statement by Mitch McConnell, that his #1 priority was to defeat the president. That was his, I think that was an honest statement on his part. It was a little dumb to make it politically. But, right now, you've got this situation where people don't want to work with a president who's in the opposite party at all, period. Zero. That's what's different. I think there have been times, I'll even say, Carter had very bad relationships with most of the senior members of the Democratic Party when he was president. Members of the senior members of the Democratic Party did not like Jimmy Carter. He didn't invite them to cabinet meetings or something. I don't know. They got annoyed at him. As a junior member, I had a great relationship with him, but senior. So sometimes you'll learn about it in the media if it's a partisan problem. But I think sometimes members of the same party with an executive don't feel appreciated enough and have difficult problems. But today, the partisan angle is so preeminent, and of course, hopefully it's less in Obama's second term because he can't run again. You know, this is, that sort of sucks air out of that balloon. But.
Sure.
Do you think that people focus too much on the image of a public servant that's supposed to be perfect, and therefore they can't speak their mind in fear of making some mistake that's going to be used against them?
Well, yeah, you know, when you're a member of Congress and somebody shoves a microphone in your face, you've got to be very careful what you say. Todd Aiken learned that one. Things that come out of your mouth will take on a life of their own.
Do you think we put too much emphasis on that rather than the candidate's actual mission?
I'm sure, but you know, look, in our society, everything is a shorthand, right? So you just can't operate in society, whether you're in Congress or you're in your job place or you're in class or wherever. We deal in shorthands. And so that's the common currency of how we communicate. And of course, on closer reflection, some of those things just prove to be very wrong or untrue. But that's sort of what we're stuck with. And maybe a better question is it getting worse because of technology? I mean, everything, if it can't be 140 characters, is it worth saying?
Now that is a perfect segue to talk later about what you had done last week in terms of your aspirations and your goals and what comes next. And any of you, by the way, they talked about what they want to do next and the skills they need to have. Communication, the use of communication skills. I'm going to give some of that back to you later. It was right on that. We're going to pick up on that after we take our break. But I want to thank Congressman Lecture. So I appreciate you doing it. Let's take, I'll tell you what, let's take a 5-minute break.